Hi guys, Paul here, and welcome to episode 2 of Primitive Pottery. In this episode we're going to take a look at actually making some pots. We're going to look at the different techniques used, and we're also going to have a look at decorating pots. And then finally we'll be looking at how to dry and store your pots safely until they're ready to be fired. So stick around and let's get stuck in. Okay guys, so before we get started with this episode, I'm just going to run you through a list of the things we're going to need in this episode. One is just a nice place to put your clay down. So you can see I've got a bit of leather here, and I just set that down, and what that allows me to do is put my clay down without getting any bits in it. Now, the last thing you want to do is go through the process of cleaning all your clay and then sit it on the ground where you've got all these bits and pieces that are just going to ruin your clay if they get into it. The other thing we're going to need is some water, and you can see I've got a bowl that I made a while ago. We'll go and get some water from the stream, and then that's really all we need for this episode. So if you have the clay at home, then please feel free to join along, and let's get started. Okay, so we have everything we need now. We've got our nice clean ball of clay that we cleaned up in the last episode. Again, if you want to look at that process, then go back to episode 1 and you'll see us go through that process there. We also have some water, and we have a nice place where we can set our clay down. So the next thing we need to do is start to work this clay a little bit more to make it a more suitable pot clay. Now all we have to do to do that is basically knead it, and what we're trying to do is squeeze the clay to try and get all the air out of it. We're also judging whether it's got enough moisture, and we're having a look again to see if we can see any impurities. So all we need to do at the moment, just to make this a little bit denser and to make it more malleable, is just to knead the clay. Now to knead the clay, there's a couple of ways you can do it. One, if you've got a nice bit of flat ground, you'll see people actually throwing the clay down and hitting it against a hard surface, and that compresses the clay. The other way is just to use the palm of your hands here to squeeze it, like so. And you can kind of lock your hands together and bring them together to really squeeze the clay. Or my personal favourite is actually just to hit the clay. So you can use the same part of your hand, just the heel of your hand here, and you can start hitting it. Now, the longer you do this, the better your clay is going to be. So I'm just going to sit here for 5 minutes and just knead the clay, just to get it to the level I'm happy with. The longer you do it for, the better your clay will be, and the more likely your pots are to come out okay. So it's about as much effort as you're willing to put in. The more you put in, the better your efforts will be. So I'm going to sit here for 5 minutes and just crack on with this. Okay guys, so I've been kneading this for maybe 5 to 10 minutes now, and you can see it's nice and soft, and it's looking very good. It's one consistent colour. I haven't seen any more debris in it, and I've also been adding moisture, so you may have seen me adding water in, and that's just because if you see it start to crack, it's an indicator that the clay is too dry. So all you have to do is dip your fingers in water, apply it to the area that's cracking, and then just start squeezing it down again. All the time I'm working it, I'm trying to keep it in a ball shape, just because if you make it big and flat, it means you're going to have to fold it over, and then you're then going to be putting air into it. So you want to try and keep it as round as possible. But as it is at the moment, I'm fairly happy with this. So we can start making our pots now. Now the first pot we're going to make is what's commonly known as a pinch pot. This is one here, and very, very simple pot. It's very quick to make, and useful for all sorts. I use them for keeping stuff in, like tools. We've got one here with paint in it for decorating later on, but I mean, it's a pot, it's got thousands of uses, and it's just a good, easy little container to make. So to start our pinch pot, what we're going to do is just remove a bit of the clay. So we don't need to use all of this to make one pinch pot, we just need a little kind of handful. So you can experiment with this and just see what suits you best in terms of size. But for me, something around there would be a good size. So just enough to fit the palm of your hand. Now, because we've just ripped that off, I'm just going to work it a wee bit more again. Just rub it around in your hands, just get it nice and smooth. Add a bit of moisture. Now, the most important thing when you're doing these primitive pots is not to add too much water. You can always add it in, but you can't take it away. And when you add too much water to clay, it just becomes a slippery mess. It's an absolute nightmare. So be very, very careful with how much water you use. I tend to just wet my fingertips and add little bits at a time, just to make sure I don't go over the top. It's one of the biggest and messiest mistakes people make with pottery. Okay, so you can see we've got a nice round ball there, and it's ready for us to start making a pinch pot. Let me bring you guys in closer and we'll talk through the process. Okay, so essentially what we're trying to make is one of these. Now, like I said, it's called a pinch pot, and the reason for that is the technique that we use to make it. Now, all we need is just our hands, and what we're going to do is just make sure our ball is nice and round and smooth. And we're going to take our index finger and our thumb, and what we're going to do is we're going to put it into the water. Now, we want our fingers to be wet. The reason for that is if we try and poke our finger in here when they're not wet, the clay is going to stick to our finger and we're going to end up kind of pulling the clay around and tearing it and causing cracks. So you want to wet your fingers like so. Now what we're going to do is hold the clay in one hand, place our thumb into the middle, and what we want to do is get it so it's till about a third of the way down, so around here approximately. So we'll do that now. Now just do this nice and slowly. Okay, so we're essentially doing that. Now you will get cracks that start to form around the sides here. All you've got to do is just push them back together. We'll deal with them later on. They're not an issue, it's just something that happens when you're doing this technique. Okay, so my thumb has made a hole there. I'm just going to wet it again, just to make it easier for my finger to slide in the next step. So our thumb goes in and our index finger is on the outside. So this whole idea is that we're going to use our fingers to pinch together to squeeze out the walls of the pot, like so. Now you want to do this very gradually, and you want to turn the ball of clay on your finger as you're going, like that. Now again, you'll see we'll get little cracks up here. Again, this isn't an issue. All you have to do is take some water on your finger and push them around and just start sealing them over. Now it's important you deal with the cracks as they turn up and you don't save them all to the very end. All this is a sign that the clay is quite dry, so this clay could actually do with being a bit more moist, but we can work with it as we go. Okay, so you can see we've got a very, very basic looking pot there. Now all we need to do is carry on that same technique all the way around until we end up with a pot that looks something similar to this. Now it's important you don't make the walls too thin, about that size is good, and the reason for that is because if we make the clay too thin, it's just going to want to fall over. It's going to be very weak, it's not going to have any structure to it, so it's just going to want to collapse. So it's important we leave a good thick wall to be able to support itself. Okay, so wet fingers and thumbs, and just slowly working your way around. Now, as the pot starts to open up, you'll notice that your finger will want to start going over the edge of the pot like this. Now that's good. The reason that's good is you want to work all of the clay. You don't want to have a very, very thick base. You want it all to be kind of an even thickness. So Make sure you're squeezing the bottom as well, and then when we're finished the pot we can level it off afterwards, and I'll show you how to do that when we get there. So, important just to keep adding moisture, sealing over any little cracks. These are all very, very small, insignificant cracks, so don't worry about them. If you have a big crack that goes all the way through the pot and all the way down to the bottom of the pot, then you've got an issue. But with these little cracks, it's really not a problem. So we're just going to keep working the pot here, and you'll be able to kind of feel with your fingers how thick the walls are getting, and they're kind of your gauge. So you're using your fingers to tell you just how thin the walls are. And again, it's important you don't make them too thin. If you find some bits are getting thicker than others, then just try and focus on those particular areas. A good gauge of that is to look at the rim of the pot, and if the rim of the pot is a fairly consistent thickness, then you know you're doing a fairly even job. If you have a bit of wall thickness that's super thick, then you know you need to focus on that area more. Okay, and then when the pot gets big enough, you can start using both fingers and thumbs, again both wet, and you can actually use 2 at a time and just speed the process up a bit. You can do it all one-handed, but doing it this way just makes the process a wee bit faster. Okay, and you can see you can end up with a pretty big pot just from a small piece of clay. Now, the limitation to this pot is the size of your thumbs, essentially. So, the reason that is because we're doing a pinch pot, the pot has to come in between our index finger and our thumb, and we only have the space up until here to use. And when we reach that limit, that's when we need to start changing over to a different technique, and that's one we'll talk about shortly. Okay, so there we have it. Now I could spend a lot longer on that and get it looking really nice, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to keep it short and sweet. Now you can see it's starting to fall over. All we need to do to fix that is just carefully grab the pot and tap it to create a nice flat base, like that. Okay? And then that allows it to sit. And there we have it. One very simple, very quick and easy clay pot. Okay, so I've taken a little bit more time off camera just to try and clean this up a little bit. Like I say, I'm trying to hurry it through, but once you start making pots you'll become a perfectionist and you'll want to try and get it as perfect as you can, and it's a thing you can really get lost in. So I'm fairly happy with that. We'll leave that to the side now. So the next pot we're going to make is the coil pot. Now, coil pots are probably one of the things that you've seen before, and what they involve are making little strings of clay and then wrapping them round to make a big pot. Now we're not going to make a big pot today just because coil pots take a lot longer than the pinch pots, and this bowl here, as it happens, is a coil pot. So you might be thinking of the ones that just go kind of straight up like a tube. However, they can be used to make bowls like this, where you have kind of just a bigger bowl essentially. I couldn't do this using the pinch pot method just because it's too big, and the coil pots really help when you reach that stage. So we'll have a look at making one of these and see how we get on. Now we're going to need our clay from before, so this is the clay we were using to make the other pot. What we want to do is make basically a small pinch pot. Now this is going to be the base for your coil pot. The reason we make a little pinch pot as the base for our coil pot is because we're using natural clay, it's not very pure. We want to avoid having very sharp edges. So if I had a flat base and I started putting coils onto that, what's going to happen is I'm going to have a flat base and I'm going to have coils going up and I'm going to have a very sharp corner here. Now sharp corners with poor quality clay tend to want to crack. So having like a little coil pot means it's nice and round, so it's very smooth and it's very strong, and we can start adding coils onto this to try and get a big pot. So I'm just going to quickly make a small coil pot, and then we can start looking at the coils and putting them on. Okay, so this is all we need to get our coil pot started, and like I say, this is going to be the base. Now it's important the base is the strongest part of the pot. It's going to be the bit that takes the most wear and tear, and it's also going to be what supports the pot as you're building it. So you can see I've made the walls on this very thick, the bottom is very thick, and I've made sure that it looks solid. There's no cracks in it or anything like that. And now this is going to be the base for our coil pot. Let me bring you guys in closer and I'll give you a bit of a closer view of how we get the coil pot started. Okay, so you can see we have our base here and it's nice and clean and it's ready to go. So all we have to do now is start producing coils to put onto this to start building our pot up. Now I don't have loads of clay unfortunately, so this is going to be a very small coil pot. However, the principle is the same, and all you have to do is just keep adding coils and building it up to the size you want. So to make a coil, first what we need is kind of a decent sized piece of clay, and what we want to do is roll it into a worm. Now when you're doing it in a primitive sense and you don't have a nice flat board to hand, there's a technique you can use to be able to roll coils without actually having a board, and all it involves is rubbing your hands together but doing it very slow and adding a lot of pressure. So you're squeezing the clay out, but you're not making the bottom shake like mad. If you do it really fast, you'll see it shakes and it begins to tear apart. So nice and slow, focusing on all different parts of it, in the middle and at either end. And what we're trying to do is make a coil long enough that it will actually go all the way around this pot. Now before we try and do that, what we basically have to do is guess how long it needs to be. Before we try and coil it, one of the most important things is to make sure the coil is wet. You want to make sure it's nice and wet so that it doesn't crack when you try to bend it. Because we're using very thick coils, they'll want to crack very easily. So you have to make it nice and wet. Now, when we go to add anything onto a pot, whether it be a coil onto a pot we're making, or whether it be a handle onto a pot that we've made, it's important that you make both pieces of the clay that are going to be becoming one wet. And you want to do that to both the piece you're adding and the piece you're going to add to. What this does is, like earlier on, like I was talking about the slip, we're creating a sort of slip which is basically like a glue, and it's going to bring both pieces together and it's going to stick them together. It's also important that you use a stick or any other sort of implement to scratch the bowl all the way around. The reason for this is, if you think of two smooth surfaces rubbing against each other, they're going to rub very easily and they're not going to catch onto each other. What we want is to create grip. We want these two things to grip together and to stay as one. So we're going to do this to both the coil and the bowl. Now this just helps it stick. Don't go deep with your scratches, just kind of barely nick the surface. And if you can get it going in different directions, that's even better. Just scratch one way and then scratch the other way. And then lastly, another bit of water over the top to create slip again, and another bit of water over the top here. And now what we have to do is place our coil onto our pot. Now you kind of have to push down quite firmly to get the two to stick. And you can see I've overestimated the size I need for this one. So if you do that, if you find that you make a coil too big, all you have to do is just kind of break off the excess where the two meet, and that's it. Now go round the pot, squeeze it down to make sure they're joined together, both the coil and the pot. And you can see it should end up looking something like that. Now it looks very, very messy at the moment, and that's absolutely fine. That's normally how it tends to look. So very, very messy. And although the coil looks very big, it's important we have it that big because we're going to use some of the clay on the coil to join the two together. Now you can either do one coil at a time, or you can add multiple coils and then process them all at the same time. Now by processing it, what I mean is joining the coils to the pots and then joining the coils to the rest of the coils. Now, I like to do maybe 2 or 3 coils and then join them all together, just because it gives you more clay to play with. Just makes life a bit easier, I've found. Your first coil will kind of be able to give you a gauge to the size of the coil you need. And then once you start getting them fairly uniform, the process can be quite quick and you can make a decent sized pot fairly quickly. Again, making another coil, making sure it's nice and wet to avoid it cracking too much. And then the process is exactly the same when you're adding a coil onto a coil. Make the coil wet, score it, and then add it on. You don't have to be super accurate with this. There's a lot of tweaking you can do when the coils are actually on. So don't worry about it being, a funny size or shape. Just worry about getting the coil onto the pot without it cracking. So you can see I've wet my coil here. I'm going to wet the coil that's on the pot already. Then I'm going to take my stick and just scratch up the surface again. Do the same with this. A little bit of water. And then add the coil on. So it's important you're looking at the area you've scored and you're facing that down onto the pot. You don't want to score it and then not actually use the scores to help you get the coil on. So the easiest way is just to put the start of the coil on the pot and then push it down onto the existing coil, and then I find it easier to be able to hold it in my hands and then just start working it round. Nice and slow, and you can see we've got a nice sized coil there. So the first one was a bit big, but as you go along you'll start to really kind of be able to estimate the size of coil you need much better. Go along and seal over any cracks just like we did with the other pot. Squeeze it down like that, and then you can see we have 2 coils on our pot now. Okay, so that's 2 coils on. You can add as many as you want before going on to the step, but I find doing 2 at a time gives you a kind of good idea of how the pot is taking shape, gives you a good idea of the size, and also just lets you clean up any bits that might break or become a problem later on. So you can see we've got our 2 coils on here. Now what we're going to do is start joining the coil to the coil and then the bottom coil to the actual base. All we need to do that is wet our finger and begin pulling the clay from this coil down to here. And what we're aiming to do is fill up this crack here, and that will be our join. Now you can do this both on the inside and the outside. If you notice, I have a bit of an overhang here, and that's intentional so that I can hold my pot and I can push the clay down just like that. Okay, so you can see how we're filling in that edge. and just work your way around, just spinning the pot in your hands like so. If you find there's any areas where the coil doesn't come out far enough, what you can do is use the bowl and you can push that up, and that'll work as well. Okay, so you can see that's basically our first coil joined on there. Now we'll do the second one in exactly the same way. We're going to push down, join the two together. Now when you come to a join in the coils, just push it from one side to the other just to close up the gap, and then just carry on working around like you would normally. Okay, and you can see we're creating this like skirt effect. So that's basically the first step to joining our coils. Now all we need to do is bring in some water and start smoothing it over. And you'll see there's a definite line here between the base and the first coil. Now what we want to do is just rub the clay until that line no longer exists and we've merged the two into one big pot. And you're just going to go all the way around and do that. Now you can do both layers at a time, so you can do top and bottom, or you can just focus on joining one coil to the base and then doing the coils separately of each other, or you can actually do them all at once by using your entire finger and going around like this. This just makes it a bit faster, and once you've practiced a bit you can actually kind of get away with this fairly easily. But if you're just starting out, then my advice would be just to focus on one coil at a time and making sure that it's well joined. Joining bits together when you're using clay is probably one of the trickiest things to get right. So you might make a few of these and they don't actually work, or they might crack as they're drying, but that's perfectly okay. You should expect that. It is the hardest part of getting clay to work, is to stick it to itself, especially when you're using clay like this, which is very kind of fresh out the ground and it's not very pure. Okay, so you can see outside now we have one smooth surface, and all we need to do on the inside is exactly what we did on the outside. So you can see inside my pot here, you can see the coils where they attached. All I'm going to do is take my finger, push down and bring the coil down to the base. Just like that. Again, when you come to a join in the coils here, just rub it one way, rub it the other way, and that joins them together, and then just carry on pushing the coil down into the base. Again, if the coil doesn't have enough clay, you can actually bring the base up to the coil, and that works equally well. Okay, so that's the first one done. Hopefully you guys will be able to see that. And now we just need to do the second one. Exactly the same way, just like so. Okay, so you can see we've ended up with a good shape there to start off with. The coils are all joined together. Now it's just a case of using water and smoothing them over to make sure they've really stuck together. This is your moment to assess the piece, to decide whether or not there's anything you need to fix before you carry on adding more coils, and it lets you have a look and just see if you're happy with the shape. Now you can see the walls in this are actually quite thick, and we can squeeze them with our fingers to kind of make the pot bigger and adjust the opening, if you like. However, I wouldn't recommend doing that too much at the beginning, because we still need to add coils onto these coils that we've already made, and so you want the surface of the coil to be quite wide so that the coil that's going onto it has plenty to stick onto. Okay, so I'm going to carry on and I'm going to make some more coils and I'm going to put them on here and we'll see what we end up with. Okay folks, so you can see we've come up with a fairly decent sized pot here, much bigger than the pinch pot that we made earlier, and this is the advantage of this method, is we can use this method to make much bigger pots. So this would be ideal for cooking in or boiling water in, and you can make these as big or as small as you want. I will say if you do make a big one, it's important you let the base dry before you get too high, otherwise it's going to be very, very unstable. So if I was to build a pot, say this high, that would be fine. If I wanted to build a pot, say this high, I would probably do about halfway and let the bottom half dry and then add the top on. Just because if you do it when it's all wet, it's going to be very, very unstable. You can see there we've got a very, very rough looking pot, and all we need to do now is leave this to dry. But before we do that, we're going to take a very quick look at some decorative stuff you can do. I'll show you a few things you can do when the pots are wet, and we'll also have a look at something you can do when it's dry as well. So I'll bring you guys in close and we can have a look at that as well. Okay, so you can see we've got our pinch pot that we made earlier here, and it looks very plain at the moment. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you're making a very simple pot and it's just going to be used and abused, then having a very simple pot doesn't really matter. However, if you want to get more decorative, there's a lot of things you can do to make your clay pots quite fancy, or to add your own little details onto them, just to make them look a bit nicer. I'll point out a few of the things that I see quite a lot on my courses and that I teach people, just because they're very simple and they allow you to customise your pot very easily. The first one is the rim here. We can do a lot with this rim. We can get it nice and smooth. You can spend a long time trying to get it nice and smooth. This makes it good for drinking out of because you've got a nice smooth surface against your lip. But what you can also do is take a stick and wet it, and you can kind of use the stick to push down into the clay, and you can make like nice little patterns around the edges, just like so. Very, very simple things, but they just make the pot that little bit more interesting and a little bit more intricate. Okay, so we can do this sort of thing. Something like that just makes the pot look a little bit nicer. And we've also got the outside we can work with. Now the outside is a very nice kind of blank canvas for us because it's nice and smooth, and we have a lot of area we can work with here. So we can draw different things into this. Again, when you're drawing anything into your clay, make sure to use a wet stick. A dry stick will just drag the clay, whereas a wet stick will kind of push the clay out of the way and leave a little trail behind it. You know, so we could make little symbols in our pots like this. I quite like crosses and stuff like that on mine. And you can do all these sorts of things. And again, just adding to the pot just to make it look a little bit nicer. It's important when you're doing this you don't go too deep and make the pot kind of structurally unsound. You don't want to push a hole through to the other side. Although you could if you wanted to do that sort of decorative route. But you can add stuff like that to the outside. You can also poke little kind of dimples into it if you want to spend a long time just poking kind of a pattern into it like this. You can do that, and that works great as well. Just like that. The other thing you can do is actually use leaves and things to sort of make an imprint on the clay itself, and that adds quite a nice little touch of decoration. You do need kind of a good leaf with a very strong outline. I don't know what this is, I just picked it up off the ground very quickly. And all you have to do there is just kind of lay it on and push the leaf into the clay. And you want to push it from both sides like that. So my finger's on the inside and this finger's on the outside, again pinching. And you want to be quite firm. And then when you take it off, you end up having the outline of the leaf. Now the camera won't pick that up very well, but I can see all the little veins in here and stuff, so that's a nice little one as well, and you can do that and add flowers and things into it as well. The other thing you can do is actually add bits onto the clay. So much like we added the coils on, all you have to do is wet the surface of the clay and whatever it is you want to add on. So let's say I want to make a little shape on here. You have to wet the piece of clay you're going to put on as well. And then you want to score it again, just with a stick to make sure that it connects properly, like so. And then with that you can actually add stuff onto it and you can make shapes on it, you can add outlines and stuff like that. The limit here really is your imagination. You can do whatever you like at this point. So you can add stuff on like that, push it down nice and hard. And you can see that adds just a nice little kind of bit of decoration as well. This pot obviously is very rough now, but I just wanted to share with you a few little decorations you can do when the pot's still wet. Now the reason I say when the pot's still wet is because there is stuff we can do to it when it's dry. And I have this pot here that I've made a while ago, and what you can actually do is use one of your clay pots you've made earlier and some rendered fat and some charcoal, and if you grind the charcoal up into a powder and add the fat in, what you end up with is essentially like a primitive paint, and you can use this to paint on the surface of your bowl, and you can draw on different shapes and you can paint whatever you like onto it obviously. And it's very, very simple, just using a stick, and you can draw onto the clay, and because the clay is dry it will suck the oil in, and that will also take the charcoal in, and then it will dry it again, but it will leave the charcoal behind, and therefore you end up with a nice steady sort of marking. So it's not going to come off, it will stay there forever once it's in there, and then when you fire it, it should stay there as well because it's charcoal, it's not going to burn up. And you can see we can make nice little sort of decorations inside there, and a very, very nice way to decorate something. Again, just doing a little bit of a... You can make a brush out of a feather if you really want to get fancy with it, and you can use all sorts of different pigments for doing this sort of stuff as well. Red ochre works well, obviously charcoal works well. You can do stuff with chalk as well, you can do inlays, but again, just to give you an idea of a little bit of decoration you can add. And of course I'm doing this on the inside, you can do this on the outside as well. You know, you can add whatever you want. So it is entirely up to you. So just a little bit extra you can do there when you start making pots and you get into it and you want to start decorating them and making them a wee bit more fancy. Simple little painting and also extra additions like that. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk about the drying process. Okay, so now that we've made some pots and we've decorated them, the next step is the most important step. I cannot stress this enough. What you have to do next is leave them to dry. Now, how long you leave them to dry for is dependent on the piece you've made. A big piece like this one here might take a couple of weeks to dry. A smaller one like this might take maybe a week. Now you might ask, how will you know when it's dry? Well, if you look at this pot here, this is actually dry and this one is wet. And there's some very subtle differences, and the way they feel, but the biggest giveaway is the colour. So this dry one is lighter than this wet one. When clay dries, it will always be lighter than its original colour. And what you're looking for is the clay to be a consistent colour as well. So if this is like light in most places and has one little kind of dark spot, then I know it's not completely dry. And when you're holding it in your hands, so it'll be lighter than it was when you first made it, because it's lost a lot of weight in moisture, and that'll be a kind of giveaway as well. But also the feel of it, you'll know just by the feel of it and also by the sound of it. If you tap it with your finger, it'll have a nice hard kind of very shallow ding to it. So again, I can't stress it enough, be sure to take the time to dry your pots out nice and slow. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode, I hope it's been useful, and in the next episode we're going to take a look at firing our pots when they've dried and have a look at that entire process. So thanks again for watching guys, and I'll see you in the next one.